Where we left off was I had asked you what it was that got you interested in history in the first place, and you had mentioned something about Uncle Borvin.
Well, that decision was made already in Oregon in 1936, where I decided to go to college. And they asked me what would be my major, and I decided definitely history. And within history, I thought especially of the Renaissance and Reformation, because while we lived in Detroit, Borvin was working at the Detroit Institute of Arts, and I heard a lot about the Renaissance, and I saw a lot of Renaissance paintings. And
Cut.
where do we go now?
So you decided in Oregon to
Major in history, and especially in Renaissance history, because of the environment that I lived in Detroit with Dr. Valentina and with Borvin working at the Detroit Institute of Arts. And I think there might have been a feeling of jealousy, he moving in this environment and I not having anything like that, having worked only at the bank in Detroit, and that wasn't very satisfactory. So at Harvard, naturally, I continued my study of Renaissance history, or history in general, and decided on a dissertation that dealt with both Renaissance music and Renaissance culture in general. So that is how the interest in history and music developed further. And it would take another 3 years to complete the dissertation and start out teaching, because I had decided that my future occupation would be teacher of history. And I was very happy to have made that decision early in life so that I could still realize it. Meanwhile, of course, the Second World War was going on. And although I had been an isolationist, in other words, I was really opposed to the intervention for various reasons, now that the war was in progress, my main hope, my main expectation was for the war to come to an early end. It was a difficult time to live because the overwhelming feeling was pro-Allied, and even after July 1941, pro-Russian, and one's allegiance didn't really squarely belong to that combination, but that's realpolitik. You have to accept the real powers of the time. And so I adjusted to it, as everybody else did. In the course of our existence in Cambridge, of course, the question of living expenses and financing oneself arose from the start, and fortunately Penny obtained a job with the Harvard Observatory for most of the Harvard years, and that was another very pleasant and productive connection for us with the astronomers, and many of the astronomers at this time were refugee scholars, so my eagerness to stay in touch with Germany and German culture was rewarded by finding many very pleasant, attractive, interesting European astronomers. Of course, during this period also, in 1941, Chris was born. We lived in this tiny apartment in Cambridge, and with the arrival of Chris, we decided we were going to get a really decent apartment, still very close to the Radcliffe campus, and that was the house on, I think, 45 Linian Street. And those were very happy years. I lived close to Professor Langer, in whose house we stayed in 39. That was a very pleasant episode, or interlude too.
Is that Suzanne Langer?
That is Suzanne's husband, that's right. And we were fairly good friends with that family, especially since they were both very musical. And once a year they had a musical powwow to which 40 or 50 people came, mostly playing music. And in between the years, we would play music at the Langer house very frequently, recorder on my part, cello on Suzanne Langer's part, and viola Langer. I still remember when I was called up sometimes on Sunday afternoon, she would call, Suzanne would call and say, Carl Gustav, as they called me then, what are you doing? I thought it was a foolish question, but I said, well, working, of course, studying. Well, could you come over do some music? Of course, I dropped everything and we went over for music. And after music, we'd have something to eat, and that was certainly very worthwhile too. So that was a very pleasant connection. Chris, I think, profited from this environment too. We would wheel him over to the observatory grounds, which was a sort of country club for us where we could relax. And I had a tennis court there, and in the winter we could ride down the hill with a sled, and so on and so forth. Well, the Harvard years were further affected by the fact that I obtained a teaching fellowship around 1941, I think, for 3 years, which involved teaching in the major survey course of history, during which I, as well as many other teaching fellows, taught separate discussion sections. And there was nothing that made me learn history more intensely, more comprehensively than trying to teach, especially the first year. And I was sometimes in agony about being prepared for the next session. The most agonizing session was the segment on English history in the late Middle Ages. When that came up in 1941, in December, I was at the observatory with Penny at a Shapley party, and there was an announcement in the news, Pearl Harbor was attacked. I still remember distinctly the reaction of all the guests at that time, and I asked myself, what's it mean? Why did Japan do it? Where is Pearl Harbor anyway, and so on. But in any case, it meant next day, no classes. And I didn't have to bone up on the English kings anymore for that particular year. And to this day, I'm kind of weak on the succession of kings in England in the late Middle Ages. Be that as it may, life went on, and in 1943, at last, I had finished the dissertation. It was accepted by my committee, which consisted incidentally of a historian, Sidney B. Fay, who was not really a specialist in Renaissance history and music, but he trusted my judgment, I guess. And the second man on the committee was Gaetano Salvemini, an Italian refugee scholar who admired particularly my bibliography. And when he looked at the back of the book, said, "You must have read an awful lot," or something of the sort. Of course, he had a sharp Italian accent. It was really very impressive to have him comment on my dissertation, that fact. And the third man on the committee was Dr. Davison, as he was called, the conductor of the Harvard Glee Club and a professor of music, of course. So they passed it perfectly easily. We had a very good time talking about it. And after that, I was a doctor of philosophy in the history department and ready to go off teaching. Now, what do you do while there's a war on, and you have a wife and a child, and you have to exist on your own. My teaching fellowship, of course, ceased at that time. So what happened? First of all, I think I started teaching German at Boston University. That was just a short period. After that, I had an offer of a teaching position as instructor, I think, or maybe it was even assistant professor, at Hoboken Institute of Technology. They invited me to come up to the campus and look it over. I thought when I went there, well, this is kind of a nice oasis in a wild surrounding, or maybe even dilapidated environment. And I said to the people who were very kind and invited me very forcefully, I decided not to go there. To stay at Hoboken for the next few years was a little too hard to swallow. And they wrote back and said, you have friends here and they're very disappointed that you didn't come. Well, the next thing was, well, this wasn't actually, sorry, wait a minute, we're in 43. The next thing was I sent a telegram to Hamilton College to teach in a special army training program, ASTP as it was called. And there I visited first two, of course, and they looked me over and decided to invite me to teach there. So we found a tenant for our apartment on Lincoln Street and moved to Hamilton College, which is in Clinton, New York. And my job there was at first very strenuous, because to lecture to 200 people, soldiers of course, but in the presence of my director, let's see, what was his name? Moritz Julius Bonn, a very distinguished German refugee scholar in economics. He was the director of the program, and so in his presence I tended almost to tremble lest I make mistakes or get stuck. Of course, I had a detailed outline. When I gave that lecture, I watched the clock, and by golly, it just didn't move on, but I looked at my manuscript, and it was being used up very rapidly, so I was getting scareder and scareder that I won't have enough soap to last for the hour. And I finally had to give in at 10 minutes to the hour. I said, thank you very much, see you tomorrow, or something like that. And afterwards at lunch, I spoke of my predicament to Professor Bonn. He said, Dr. Anthon, you're the most popular professor around here because you gave them 10 minutes of freedom. So that was very reassuring. That program lasted from fall of 1943 till April 1944. Meanwhile, by the way, I had invited my mother, Mutti, to live with us in Clinton. And when we moved to Geneva, I found a house, an old house it was, about probably early 19th century. And Mother came to visit, to live with us there too. And as I may have said before in this program, in this interview, that she fell ill from cancer at about the time of my birthday, 19th of May. And shortly after that birthday, she went to bed and was severely ill, which was ameliorated by injections of morphine. And within less than 2 weeks, she died in Geneva, New York. Meanwhile, the program in Geneva, which was to the Navy now, and I had to suddenly, out of nowhere teach courses in American history, which I had never taken in university, and on colonial history. also sometimes in the presence of the director there. I was just about one day or one page ahead of the students. That's the situation. But that Navy program came to an end in, I think, about August of that same summer. Meanwhile, I had sounded out possibilities in the area, and I heard of vacancies in Cornell University, which was just across the lake from where we were in Geneva. A wonderful train went from Geneva to Ithaca, during which one was served a very nice meal. Of course, you paid for it, but it was very nice. One of the friends with whom I became acquainted and who also went to Cornell was Alan Little, and Alan Little turned up years later in the Foreign Service Institute here in Washington, where I was lecturing occasionally. And there I saw him. I said, "That must be Alan Little." And he said, "Yes, where do you come from?" and so on and so forth. We exchanged notes about our careers over the many, many years. So I went to Cornell. I was given the job there to teach European history in general, in other words, 1800 to the present or something like that. And that was a little easier. Meanwhile, Penny went to the hospital in Geneva, and Mike appeared in this world. We had a basement apartment right at the edge of the campus, very pleasant situation. And Ithaca, in fact, proved to be one of the most romantic places to live in. And I bicycled around in the environs, especially to the various waterfalls that abound in the area, in Buttermilk Falls and Seneca Falls and so on. Well, that program too went till spring of 45. By this time, the war was rapidly approaching its end, and I was praying for it to end. And I also was praying to get to Germany either with the State Department, Foreign Service, or with the Army or some such opportunity. I wrote to Washington. In fact, I was even asked for an interview this was about April. I saw several friends of mine from Harvard working at the OSS in Washington. So I saw them, and we compared notes about job possibilities. But the interview with the Department of State man was most unfortunate. He asked, "Well, you want to be in the American occupation authorities in Europe?" "I wouldn't advise it," he said. You look blonde, speak German, you are German, you'd be regarded as a pro-fascist." Can you imagine such ludicrous conversation? At any rate, I didn't get a job with the Foreign Service at that time. So back I went, got another job in the meantime. Jobs were coming from all sides in those days, possibly because so many historians were involved in the military forces. At any rate, this job was at the MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, teaching European history and American history combined. In other words, it was to be a series of lectures on European history in its relation to America and vice versa, which was most instructive, most enlightening, but also very difficult to master on such short notice. But I don't know whether we've discussed my appointment at Colby before in this conversation. At any rate, I still had to look for a regular job now. The war was over. While I was at Cornell, I was taking organ lessons from Dick Gore, who was the organist there. They had a beautiful organ, Baroque organ, made in Boston. And as I was playing some pieces in the chapel, a party of a couple of men came into the chapter to look it over, seeing what it's like and so on. And I saw him and I thought, oh my gosh, that's Professor Bixler from Harvard, who had become president of Colby College. So we had a little talk. We both agreed we loved Bach. Both agreed we were both musical and musicians. And he knew that I was looking for a job. I guess I made that quite plain to him. When he went back to Waterville, Maine, at Colby College, he sent me a telegram or letter asking whether I might be interested in coming to Colby for a lecture. It didn't say for a job, just as a visitor. Well, needless to say, I hopped on the next train. We had an interview, very pleasant interview, with a very cultivated man. It was a pleasure. And I first had to meet the faculty in a sort of colloquium about a subject I chose, which was amateurs in American history, beginning with Jefferson and various other personalities who had avocations in music or painting or some other arts, which was a very stimulating conversation with the faculty. They were very friendly and informed, so on. I was not very well informed about Americans. And by the way, in connection with that article on amateurism, I visited Mark Van Doren in New York City, who was a poet and professor at Columbia, very cultivated man living in the village in New York. And he saw also his brother Carl Van Doren, who had written a marvelous biography of Benjamin Franklin, a very educated, well and cultivated gentleman also at Columbia. And I wrote a number of letters to Graham Swing, or what's his name, first name? Swing in any case.
Raymond Grant.
Raymond Grant Smith, yes. Or some other people that I've forgotten about, whose letters I still have. At any rate, after giving that colloquium on amateurism to the faculty at Colby, I was asked to give a lecture to the students, the international club there. So I gave a lecture on the transfer of populations, which was based on the first mass transfer of population from Turkey to Greece, and of Greeks from Greek to Turkey. I don't need to discuss that incident, but apparently the audience liked the lecture, and the next thing I knew was that Bixler said to me, Dr. Anthon, perhaps you had already surmised that we are interested in filling another position in history, and would you be interested? I would have shouted, rhetorical question that, useless. I was trembling with excitement. Well, took the train home, and next thing a telegram came from Colby offering a position as assistant professor of history with such a salary. I think it was $3,000, which at that time was very respectable for a beginning instructor, and an increase in salary by $100 every year or something like that. So the upshot of it, of course, was that we moved from Cambridge, which we had enjoyed for 7 years, I think. Yeah, for about 7 years. And moved to an old house, Foster House it was called, related to the Foster Dulles family, as I remember. At any rate, moved into this house right close to the old campus in Waterville, which also was near the railroad track, for which reason the Colby Board of Trustees decided to sell the old campus down in town and move up to a hill called Mayflower Hill, where they had to build all the buildings fresh, of course, in the Neo-Georgian style. It was all very, very pleasant, all very attractive, and we spent very pleasant years with our youngsters, Chris and Mike. We have all kinds of pictures from that period. At Colby, I taught courses in modern European history, German history, and, of course, Renaissance and Reformation. All things that I wanted and had a free hand in. And it was a pleasure to be on the threshold, as it were, of a brand new campus and doing all sorts of things, such as ordering the books one wanted at the library and various other helpful activities. Also, the new chapel there needed a new organ. And President Bixler turned to me and said, could I recommend a German organ maker who could make the kind of organ you think we should have? And I said we should have a Baroque organ. So I recommended Weigel near Stuttgart, and eventually Weigel, who had made an organ already for Freiburg, I think, and it was subsidized by Matthew Mellon, this was, I think. So Bixler was able to persuade Matthew Mellon to subsidize an organ for Colby College too, and after I left in '49, they started building a new organ, and it was apparently a great success. Well, what happened after that? In '49, I heard about opportunities for working in Europe, especially in Germany, involving the writing of the history of the American occupation in Germany from '45 onwards. So for that I went to Washington for an interview, had long and several interviews with people about my interest. I still remember the head of the histories branch or division at the Pentagon was Greenfield, I forget his first name, and he said, what was your dissertation? I said, Italian Renaissance music and musicians, and he shouted right back in Italian something to the effect that how nice to meet somebody who is interested in Italian history, because he, Greenfield, had written a book on Risorgimento or some such period in Italian history. So I think that was a point in my favor. Another conversation I remember was with a German refugee in the Civil Affairs Division, who outlined not only the work in Berlin, which is what was now being offered, but also living conditions. And he said, Mr. Anthon, you will find wonderful stores with wines and liquors and so on that you will enjoy having in your house. And I thought that's the last thing I need to know, but he thought that was a great perk. At any rate, they offered the job to me, and so in February 1949 I packed my trunk and things, went to Berlin to be a historian at a fabulous salary compared to the Colby salary, and of course very wonderful perks in the form of free rent of a house, beautiful house in a beautiful neighborhood, and free personnel, that is a maid or cook, and a man to stoke the furnace. In those days still had to be stoked, and various other perks. But the most important thing, of course, was that Penny had decided not to come with me, and we had a very hard time separating before I flew off from West Overfield in Springfield, Massachusetts in February '49. And I still remember when we came to Frankfurt, how we had to stay there for hours because of the Berlin blockade going on, and our plane couldn't get into the landing pattern while the airlift was going on. So when I did get to Berlin, I stayed at a hotel for guests called on Goslarstrasse, I think it was, for several days while I made the contact with the historical branch, or hysterical branch as some called it, to find out just what my work schedule would be, and so on and so forth. And so I lived there as a bachelor for a number of months. Those were very painful months, and until I met Margaret, somewhere around April or May 1949. And one of the points of particular interest was her pronunciation of German words, which impressed me, and she used the word Gemeinschaft. I thought, this is a very skilled American who speaks German without an accent. I didn't hear any other words, I don't think, but that caught on. So we made a date for April 1st of that year to go to a play. And we decided to meet at this U-Bahn station at Oskar Helene Heim on Kleallee. I stood there, and I stood there, and I stood there, and Miss Day did not arrive. Finally, after about half an hour of waiting, there she was. I still remember the hat she wore. And so we happily went to the, I think, Renaissance Theater in Kurfürstendamm, saw a very charming play by Priestley, I think. And so things developed in the course of the next months, to the extent we decided to get married in the fall of that year. Mother went on a vacation to Lincoln. We drove together to Hamburg, and she spent the next 2 months, I think it was, of vacation in Lincoln. And we decided to get married in December, last day of December 1949, at a church in Dahlem, the Dahlem Dorfkirche, at which Pastor Niemöller, the famous leader of the confessional church, preached, occasionally at least. And the wedding was memorable, not only for the presence of German friends from the Nachbarschaftsheim and other German friends, but also the very generous and pleasant reception which our friend Esther Franklin gave us at the house where I had been living as a bachelor during that summer. And after the, oh, by the way, the marriage ceremony was very brief because it was the church was unheated. We were shivering, and I found musicians who would play some Handel music on a small organ, kind of a harmonium. And I think some of our German friends who attended the wedding were disappointed that we stopped so early. Frau Meinecke, for instance, dear old Frau Meinecke, who came to that wedding and befriended us throughout our stay, in that we lived right in the neighborhood of the Meinecke family. At any rate, after the wedding reception, we drove off through the Russian zone, it was still called the Soviet zone, to, now what was the name of the town at the other end? I forgot. At any rate, we drove to the checkpoint at the western end of the Autobahn and stayed in a billet of some sort for American personnel, and then on to the Harz in the next morning. and on to Nuremberg, I think. Finally to Innsbruck. No, we didn't get to Innsbruck, I don't think. To Zurich, in any case. And then finally, we thought we'd go to Italy, but we didn't go to Italy on that occasion. But it had a very pleasant trip through Switzerland. I don't think we got to Austria either on that occasion. Well, be that as it may. Back to Berlin, and there we were finally settled into a German villa on Imdol, which is a very lovely community on the edge of the Grunewald in Berlin. Stop. We start.
So you returned from your honeymoon to Berlin in the winter of 1950.
That's right. And we were assigned a villa in the lovely streets of Dahlem, Imdol. And as I said, the house was beautifully furnished, and we had the services of a very devoted and competent housekeeper, namely Lena, and the help of a gardener and heater, I suppose, or stove man. What was his name? Have Waxman or something like that? I've forgotten. Very nice, quiet and helpful and industrious person. Well, first of all, we have to talk a little about my activity. Why did I go to Berlin? First of all, of course, I wanted to get back to post-war Germany and really observe what was going on, and to try to find out what the Germans were now thinking with regard to the past, the Hitler regime, how they had fared, and what they thought of the future. My job was to be a part of a historical team at the American headquarters in Dahlem to write the history of the American occupation from 1945 to the present. That involved going over lots and lots of documents resulting from meetings and decisions of various Allied commissions and Allied meetings of various sorts deciding the development of the occupation in the American zone. Actually, we didn't get to writing the history. Actually, we were preoccupied with producing a very detailed chronology of events. And as I later learned, that had been ordered by the commander, General Lucius Clay, to use for his own memoirs someday. And after he left in 1949, he wrote his memoirs, and I could clearly see that he had used our chronology. But it wasn't a very productive lot, and I think perhaps colleagues in OMGUS, as it was called, the Office of Military Government, colleagues in OMGUS were perhaps right when they called us the hysterical branch rather than historical. But it was interesting in many ways, and of course it was a singular period, absolutely unique in history, which probably will never occur again the same way. We had close relations with the Germans officially, but also in a social way, and it was most enlightening what these German individuals and families had experienced during the war and what they were now doing, many of them as officials with the Berlin government. We were particularly impressed with and happy with the head of the German Berlin government, namely Mayor Ernst Reuter, a very plucky courageous, intelligent, well-meaning, and popular mayor who led the Berliners from one crisis to another, keeping up their morale. He gave a weekly report, you might say, about Berlin matters under the title Wo uns der Schuh drückt, where the shoe presses us painfully. So he talked about these things just the way FDR used to talk in fireside chats. Mayor Reuter spoke once a week to his Berliners. I had something to do with him in connection with the universities and colleges of Berlin, because after less than a year I switched from the historical branch, which was gradually being transferred away and liquidated. I switched to intelligence, and I stayed there with Harold Stearns as chief for about half a year, I guess it was, and switched over to higher education advisor for West Berlin, which was particularly fascinating because the Berliners were just building up a new university in late 48 or early 49. What happened was that the East Berlin University, the so-called Humboldt University, was obviously becoming Sovietized and communized, in other words, integrated into the communist system, which meant rigid indoctrination for the students, and professors too for that matter, so that there was a growing movement in the Humboldt University for a free university, free from communist and Soviet yoke. And in the fall of 49, that movement got the support of the American authorities, and a free university was set up, first in a very fragmentary manner, because there were no buildings really, no facilities, very little money. But the American authorities supported this movement with money and action. And so in November of 48, the beginning usually of the winter semester, the Free University opened its doors in one building in Dahlem, and soon in a number of other buildings, really more like shacks than university structures. But the spirit was there. The students were thrilled to have their own university, thrilled to have professors come either from West Germany or East Germany to teach in this new venture. And among the various achievements of the Americans, I think, was that can you stop for a moment?